Okay.
So I will be the moderator for this session. As we know that, okay, this session, we will be discussing navigating a drier world. Coming out from this morning's excellent presentation from Professor Taylor, would have gotten a fair idea of, well, a comprehensive picture, idea, and narrative of what we expect as it relates to a drier climate here. And it's not only for the only globally, but obviously the Caribbean region is going to be affected. So we are very sensitive to this impact, sir. So with no further ado, we have three presenters today. They are Clive Carpenter, Mr. Alfred Grunwaldt, and Dr. Adrian Cashman. So I would just like to give a quick bio of for first presenter, who is going to be Clive. So Clive, obviously, Clive is a carpenter, is an international water resource specialist, focusing on water sector and climate resilience in small island developing states. He has more than 30 years experience in the Caribbean region, Pacific, and also the Indian Ocean, and I've worked in more than 30 countries, islands, including Jamaica, St. Lucia, Grenada, Antigua and Barbuda, and Trinidad and Tobago. He has been an expert advisor to UNDP and the Asian Development Bank on water sector climate adaptation, and currently advises UNDP on climate resilience sector, security, design, and submission to the Green Climate Fund. From 2018 to 2020, Clive was the lead the team leader on the regional track for the PPCR. It relates to rainwater harvesting program and investigating the role and the replication mechanism for rainwater harvesting as an adaptation approach in the region. Each panelist would be have a time allocated for each panelist between 8 to 10 minutes. So Clive, we are here to hear from you now.
Thank you very much, Colin. I'm just going to share my screen. So if right. So can I just confirm that you can see my screen, Colin?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Cash.
Sure, I can see it, yeah.
Thank you very much. So as you are aware, this section is on water security in a drier world. The small introduction that was provided as part of the conference papers refers to the regional track of the PPCR undertaking a regional rainwater harvesting initiative. And what I'd like to do is just run you briefly through the purpose of this initiative and some of the outcomes that were generated by it. It raises some interesting questions far beyond rainwater harvesting, and these may well form part of our discussion. It's a new approach to household rainwater harvesting. The focus of the project was
la récolte d'eau. Et pour essayer de comprendre les leçons du passé et les interventions.
Going forward to the future. As many of you will know, the regional track of the PPCR, the Pilot Programme for Climate Resilience, its purpose is to upscale investment in climate risk resilience measures. And rainwater harvesting was seen by the PPCR as having the potential to increase household water security resilience to climate change risks. So the purpose of the project was to try and understand why rainwater harvesting isn't more commonly used in the region, and then having understood what these barriers are, to then try and develop a series of tools and approaches to promote rainwater harvesting replication as a climate change adaptation measure in the region. And this was a 2-year project. It was very much a sort of multifaceted, multi-dimensional kind of intervention. But its outcome was the development of a radically different approach to implementing rainwater harvesting. And as I said, there are lessons in here that that go well beyond rainwater harvesting. But I will run you through this briefly. It is a major investment.
Je voulais vraiment vous dire que c'est un grand investissement de temps et d'effort. Et
interest in this conference. So the purpose of this 2-year study was to investigate, or it's an investigation into the lack of wide-scale rainwater harvesting use, and to understand why this wasn't happening, because, and does it have a role in terms of contributing to household water security, or the lack of it, was it contributing to insecurity? And there were 10 or more components to the project. It started off with an assessment of water insecurity in each country, trying to understand what the causes of that were, and how that varied between countries and within the countries. Because it was looking at water insecurity at the household level, it had to look at the different supplies and sources of water that contribute to water supply to households. So it included looking at the utilities. There were 3 countries that we focused in on: Grenada, St. Lucia, and Jamaica. And these have different levels of water utility provision. And this becomes quite an important driver in terms of rainwater harvesting use. Second thing that we needed to do was understand the current rainwater harvesting practices and the reasons they are occurring. And this was done primarily through household surveys. More than 300 households were surveyed across the 3 countries, with more than 50,000 responses. We undertook a review of the previous rainwater harvesting initiatives. Many of you will be familiar that there have been many initiatives in the region, and tried to understand some of their successes and failures and their relevance to households. We undertook a review of rainwater harvesting water quality, because even at the earlier stages of the project design, which obviously predated our input, it was clear that water quality and concerns about water quality were a critical issue for many households. We then undertook a review of existing rainwater harvesting policies and incentives, and then undertook a financial analysis of both the costs of rainwater harvesting interventions, as well as looking at incentive mechanisms for influencing the financial costs to householders. And this resulted us in developing a new approach, which we call rainwater harvesting incremental risk reduction. And whilst I'm not going to go into that approach in detail, I will explain to you what I mean by that. We developed a whole series of rainwater harvesting training materials that were wrapped around this, and these were delivered as national training workshops in those 3 countries, but of course they're available as a regional resource. And then we designed a series of instruments to try and improve the widest replication of rainwater harvesting, including policies, legislation, and financial incentives. This is an example of a drought vulnerability map that we developed for St. Lucia, and this formed part of the water security or insecurity mapping of the 3 countries. We developed over 20 different metrics, primarily using public domain data coupled with local census information. This particular one is looking at effective rainfall, which is precipitation minus evaporation, and ranks the basins into 5 different categories, from red, dry, to dark blue, the wettest. And this enabled us to focus in on identifying households or communities that were exposed to different levels of drought risk, but
Ils sont
also
exposés à d'autres niveaux de risque, à différents niveaux de risque.
the dark blue colors is the lowest ranking in terms of the least vulnerable to drought. But these areas, it turned out, were highly vulnerable to flood risk, and they were also highly vulnerable to elevated levels of turbidity after storms, which were causing problems for the water utilities. So different metrics were developed to explore different climatic hazards. And I suppose one of the messages I'd like you to take away, although of course it's obvious, is that with increasing climate change, we're not just talking about an increasingly drier world, we're also talking about periods of increased flooding and excess water. So the purpose really of this project was to try and get an evidence-based understanding of current household rainwater harvesting use and lack of use, and try and understand what the barriers were that were preventing rainwater harvesting being used more widely. And this we achieved by undertaking household surveys known as CAPS, or Knowledge, Attitude and Practice Surveys, in each of the 3 countries. And there were some clear conclusions that came out of that work. The first was that rainwater harvesting as a primary source only occurs, or really only occurs, in those areas without an effective utility supply. I mean, this is a fairly obvious conclusion, but actually it's something that is critical to understanding how rainwater harvesting could and should be promoted. So this mostly occurs in rural Jamaica in those 3 countries, but it also occurs in Carriacou, off mainland island in Grenada. But rainwater harvesting is actually widely used as a secondary water source, but it's always secondary to the water utility supply, which is the primary source. Rainwater harvesting as a secondary source was most common in these drier areas and areas that suffered from frequent utility interruptions. And it's worth saying that in St. Lucia and Grenada, we're talking about water utility provision of 96 to 98% across the main islands, whereas in Jamaica, it's more like sort of 65%, something like that. Commonly, or most commonly, rainwater harvesting is usually undertaken in a very informal way. Construction is typically of barrels and drums, and this is kind of island-wide because it's very much this secondary, undervalued way of capturing water. Tanks are generally present, obviously these have much greater storage and therefore have much greater associated cost in drier areas. Generally, this ad hoc rainwater harvesting has ad hoc maintenance. Again, it was better in dry areas than those areas of non-utility provision. Rainwater harvesting was most widely used during periods when the utility supply fails. And this is the critical point. But interestingly, mostly because I guess of the wide provision of water utility, it was most commonly used during or just following the storm periods, the storm seasons, when the utilities were knocked out of action for typically 1 to 2 weeks. It's not most widely used during the dry season, other than in those areas where obviously water utility provision is relatively minor. Water quality concerns were routinely mentioned as a major barrier to people undertaking rainwater harvesting. And this, of course, is not a climate resilience issue. And perhaps this is another point that I want to get across, that climate resilience and climate adaptation is part of a wider set of development challenges and is part of a wider group of, or competing with a wider group of priorities at the household level and of course at the national level. And we need to remember this rather than treating it just in isolation. In the drier areas, it was up to 5 times more likely for rainwater harvesting to be used, to be treated and to be drunk than in the areas that weren't so dry. But the other major barrier that came up time and time again was this issue of cost, that the cost of what we call formal rainwater harvesting, so a properly designed complete system with a large tank, is too high and it prevents uptake. So these were barriers that preventing wider scale use. We reviewed more than 150 existing rainwater harvesting guidelines because there has been an enormous effort to address and promote rainwater harvesting in the region. What we found, however, was that there was very much a focus on the design, construction, and maintenance of newly constructed, best practice, entire system rainwater harvesting infrastructure. Guidelines tend to be quite technical. They're very much suited towards engineers and architects and project managers, and perhaps not so accessible to your average householder. There was little recognition of this cost as an inhibitor to rainwater harvesting, hence the focus on best practice, and little consideration of the role of rainwater harvesting to the majority of households, which is that it's this backup supply that they're not interested in sustaining or giving the same priority or investing in as if it was their primary source. Generally, there was a failure to adequately assess and design for drought risk and the reduction of that risk. Sometimes there would be over-design, too much storage, which would make things too expensive, or there would be under-design, not enough storage, which then means that there's the potential, if you're moving people off one source onto another, that you're creating a maladaptation risk. There was little consideration of rainwater harvesting having to deal with the tropical storms and hurricane winds that it would have to survive through the wet season or periods, and little recognition of specific climate change alterations or trends in terms of increasing aridity or increasing wind strength or increasing rainfall intensity in any of the designs. Little consideration of gender, which is probably true about many projects, and that all the construction projects focused on communal assets. So there was very few good examples of household scale interventions.
I'm sorry, Clive. Yeah, we are running out of time. Can you please wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'll just go on to the next page. So this idea of incremental risk reduction, what does it mean? This is my last slide. So we recognize that householders are already practicing informal rainwater harvesting, but they're not using it for drinking water. Any approach has to focus on improving water quality, but it has to be done in an affordable manner. And this is a bit controversial, but you shouldn't be promoting expensive new entire rainwater harvesting systems as the only way forward, because the majority of households won't be able to afford this. Instead, you have to link household interventions in rainwater harvesting to specific water quality improvements, and that the household investments in these improvements need to be at smaller scale upgrades to their existing systems to enable them to afford them. This means we need to empower these householders to be able to identify these water quality risks. And then that means that they have to understand what the water quality risks are in each part of the system, the roof, the transmission system, the tank, and then how they use it. So they have to understand how then to reduce these risks. And if they understand how to reduce the risks, then this means that they can identify their own small, affordable upgrade measures. And when they undertake these upgrade measures, they can see actual tangible improvements in water quality. And this becomes a feedback process promoting them to increase their investment. Each household can then develop in their own time, with their own resources, a program of risk reduction measures. And then by adding water quantity to these water quality risks, this then enables you to support their identification and risk reduction process to include drought. So this approach we call incremental risk reduction. There's a lot more information on it. We use two different types of approaches. One follows the WHO approach and one follows the UNICEF approach. And there's a lot of information and guidance and support materials on the regional PPCR web platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. As you know that we are not, because of the interest of time, we are very limited. So I seek the indulgence of the other presenters to shorten your presentation. So we go straight to Alfred. So I just want to give a small bio of Alfred, which Alfred is a climate change senior specialist in the climate change division at the Inter-American Development Bank. And he's currently the focal point on climate and infrastructure development at IDB and provides technical advice in the mainstreaming of adaptation to climate change. and climate resilience in development of operation. In the last 10 years, Alfred has dedicated a large portion of his work to water and climate issues in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. So Alfred has worked with the World Bank, and he's graduated with a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Notre in Colombia, and holds a master's degree in competition mechanics of material and structure. So Alfred, you have the floor.
Thank you, Colin. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So I uploaded my presentation. I hope you can see it.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So good morning, good afternoon to all the people that are connected. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk in this panel. Very honored to be here. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a study that we conducted in Bolivia in the context of the PPCR, national PPCR that is being implemented in that country. It's about building adaptive capacity in the water sector using a framework that was developed by the University of Geneva. So in the presentation, I'm going to be talking about general information about the impacts of climate change at the global level in Bolivia. Then I'm going to connect that to the Paris alignment and the call for building adaptive capacity. And then I'm going to go into the study, the specific objective of the study on adaptive capacity in the water sector for Bolivia, talking briefly about the analytical framework, and then hitting into the main results of the study. And then I'm going to finalize with a new study on just transition for the water sector that we're just studying in Bolivia. So let me first start with what the IPCC is mentioning about freshwater resources all around the globe. As you see here in the picture, almost all of the countries are going to be impacted by climate change, and their freshwater resources are going to suffer. All the colors that you see in red, yellow, orange are countries that are going to see a depletion in freshwater resources. On the contrary, other countries around the world that you can see in colors from purple to blue are going to see an increase in freshwater resources. If we focus now in the Andean region, for example, in South America, then we see that tropical glaciers provide significant amount of water at the watershed level, and that water is being used for water security in many cities in the Andean region. This publication that came out in 2006 by Dr. Bradley says that all these glaciers are going to start retreating really fast, and this is going to bring problems for water security in the main cities. If you see here at on the left side of the graphic, you see low latitude in the south, and where the red circle is on the figure that you see on the right, that's basically where all the main tropical glaciers in the Andean Cordillera are. In the case of Bolivia, for example, where you see glaciers that are between 5,000 and 7,000 meters above the sea level, you'll see a very high change of temperature that could go up to 5.5 degrees. Then, of course, La Paz, and in particular Bolivia, the northern part of the country has gone through very bad water crisis, droughts that have repeated itself every 10 to 5 years. The last one took place in 2016. It was really bad with a lot of economic losses. But on the other side, they have also a lot of flooding occurring on the southern part of the country, and also in La Paz, they have been experiencing also flooding. So there is a destabilization of the hydrological cycle that is bringing a lot of problems to plan the use of water, and also is bringing a lot of economic losses. So, and this is not changing. Basically, what we see from models is that in the case of Bolivia, for example, the number of consecutive dry days is going to increase almost in all the country in different ways, but it's almost in all the country the same behavior. So moving into the Paris alignment, what's going on? So the Paris alignment in its Article 7 tells us that it is important to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, reduce vulnerability in the context of sustainable development. So this is one of the main motivations that drove us into carrying out the study that I'm going to talk about. So basically, the main objective of the study was to assess the potential for building transformative institutional adaptive capacity in the water sector in Bolivia with three main research questions. The first question was about the governance process in Bolivia. So we wanted to know how the existing governance process facilitated adaptive capacity. Then we went into the difficulties. So what are the main difficulties to build adaptive capacity across different scales and how these might be overcome? And then the last question was related to the potential for an adaptation program, which in this case was the PPCR, to influence water governance processes and achieve this transformative change. So in order to do that, we needed to have a framework. And as I mentioned before, this framework was developed by the University of Geneva back in 2014, sorry. And that framework basically helped us to categorize the specific adaptation process going on in the sector, in the country. Moving from the left to right, the framework allows us to categorize the different stages of adaptation. So the left is the place where you wouldn't like to be because it's the business as usual. Basically, nothing is happening in terms of adaptation. You just follow the business as usual mode. The one in the middle, we call it incremental adaptation, which basically we see some responses that exhibited, some aspects of technical or governance innovation, to decision making or water resources management. And then at the end, you can see the transformative adaptation, which is basically where you want to be, where you see a lot of integration of ecological and social considerations and some traits of managing water. So with that in mind, let me just go into more detail about the framework itself. So the framework was developed at the University of Geneva, as I mentioned to you before. And under the framework, governance is seen as the key driver of adaptive capacity and the type of adaptation actions occur in the water sector. So by exploring how governance systems have managed and responded to past extreme events, in this case, we took as an example the drought event that happened in 2016 and then previous events of flooding that happened in the southern part of the country, we could see actual manifestations of adaptive capacity or identify certain manifestations of adaptive capacity. And in that way, we can examine how governance practices hinder or enable building adaptive capacity. So the framework recognizes three key determinants that in this case are regime, knowledge, and network. So regime is related to rules, policy, legal, regulatory and water rights, and finances. Knowledge is related to information and technological inputs into water governance. And the networks is related to the way in which stakeholders interact and cooperate. Under each one of these determinants, we have a set of indicators. We have around 33 indicators in total. And for each one of these indicators, we have specific operational criteria that we have defined. So we analyzed these indicators at three different scales, national, regional, and local, in order to take a picture of the water sector in this particular moment to analyze in which state we were, as I mentioned before, transformative, persistent, or passive adaptation. And the idea is that by using this framework every certain period of time, we can see how the sector will be evolving or building adaptive capacity. Okay, so some of the main results. Here again, you see knowledge, which is the determinant, and then the different indicators on the right side. Evaluation and planning, for example, monitoring and assessment and transparency. Each one of the boxes underneath relates to operational criteria. So in the case of evaluation and planning, you see three boxes, one operational criteria for each one of those boxes. So if it's red, that means that it's a passive process. If
okay.
it's,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So time is up now. So we
Oh,
to the other
really? That was 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Then do you want me to stop there?
Yeah.
Okay.
We could have a further any questions and we could have further discussion. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'll stop there then.
Okay. So now we go to Dr. Cashman. Dr. Cashman has published a lot of work as relates to the field, well, different areas in geography, resource management, and future studies, with nearly 40 peer reviews, publication, as well as conference proceedings, presentation, books, chapters. He has worked with a wide range of international organizations on water and climate-related matters. He is a reviewer at the IPCC on the IPCC 6 assessment report and an editor for the Water Supply Journal, as well as a reviewer for several journals. He serves on the Global Technical Advisory Committee for Global Water Partnership is Vice Chair for the Global Water Partnership Caribbean Technical Committee. He has worked with the Caribbean Community Climate Change and Inter-American Development Bank, FAO, United Nations Program, United Nations Environment Program, and Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Dr. Cashman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Colin, and I trust that you can see my screen.
Yes, I can.
Good. I'm going to take a little bit of an overview of a sort of broad overview. The title is Navigating a Drier World, and my question in response to that is, can we close the water cycle?
Arriver à fermer le cycle de l'eau. Et je vais vous donner quelques informations d'arrière-plan.
Regardons
Quelles sont les perspectives en ce qui concerne le climat dans la région de la Caraïbe? On peut mettre dresser le tableau avec la Dominique et la plupart des modèles de la Caraïbe orientale concernant la Dominique, ils suggèrent une augmentation, une tendance à la sécheresse et une réduction de la pluviosité. Et on voit que c'est un thème plus élevé pour la Dominique.
Le niveau de pluie
et pour voir jusqu'en
2041-2070.
Et on peut voir ce que vous pouvez remarquer. C'est une des sécheresses qui sont très marquées, qui sont marquantes, et particulièrement dans la saison sèche et la saison humide. Vous avez également cette sécheresse qui continue. Vous avez à peu près plusieurs éléments qui apparaissent dans la saison et qui ont des valeurs assez importantes.
Significantly as well. So that is in terms of climate and rainfall. And I want to look at rainfall. Just remember that in terms of water availability, just because you get a 15% drop in precipitation doesn't mean that your water resources only drop by 15%. It can be a lot more when you add in the temperature effects as well. So the outlook then is that there is going to be less water available. There's going to be greater variability in our climate, and as we've seen, longer dry spells. So how are we going to respond to this? So this sort of existential questions, if you like. We're going to have to use less of the available resource because there will be less available resource anyway.
De l'eau disponible parce qu'il y aura moins d'eau disponible. Cela veut dire que nous devons augmenter l'efficacité de l'usage et d'augmenter et d'améliorer la façon de...
Sustainable basis. You'll see where I'm going with this as I come towards the end of my presentation. And let's just take as an example, what does this mean? And I'm using Jamaica here. So already non-agricultural water demand in Jamaica accounts for about 30% of the total demand. 40% of the population lives in the Kingston metropolitan area and the St. Catherine's parish. There is with that level of population, there's increasing demand for housing. And what we're seeing is often large housing developments taking place. If you look at the allocation of the available water resources within Kingston metropolitan area, St. Catherine's, you'll see that the available water resources, according to the Water Resources Authority, pretty much equals the water demand. So we're at the limits of what can be got out of the existing systems. And also wastewater collection and treatment, there's about 50% coverage in the Kingston metropolitan area. And most household, and note this, most household water consumption ends up as wastewater, which we're throwing away. Now, recently there's been in connection with PPCR and the interim and IDB, there's been a project through JN Foundation, the Water Project, which has been looking at how to improve water adaptation. And there's two tracks to this. There's the one is the funds and loans for integrating water adaptation measures into existing, new and existing housing. Interestingly, and it builds on some things that Clive has been saying earlier on, there is more uptake in the new build by developers than in retrofitting water adaptation measures in the home by homeowners. And that package there includes rainwater harvesting tanks. It also includes water efficient appliances in with the home. The other one is, yes, you can offer the loans to make things easy. You still have to pay it back. But in conjunction with that, you need the technical cooperation component, demonstrating that there is a business case here, that there is capacity to install these measures, and also to suggest and encourage entrepreneurship, the offering of services within this new environment, this new paradigm that we're entering into. And going together with that, the awareness of the threat of climate change, and that there are opportunities here. And this brings me to the point about the opportunities for closing the water cycle there. Because we're seeing already, I think, the beginnings of what could be a future in the Caribbean. Average homes consume about 15 cubic meters per month in Jamaica at a cost of about $21 US per month to the household. At the level of a development or building, it would technically be possible to capture and use rainwater, to treat and reuse pre-consumed water. I call it pre-consumed, specifically not wastewater, because that has a negative connotation, and that there are possibilities of recovering resources. And we're already seeing examples of this in one or two places. The critical element, though, is storage, the storage component. I'm not going to build on that at the moment. If we have time, I will like to say a few more words on that. But what are the challenges? Well, first of all, as we've said, there's the finance, and how do we monetize and bring home those benefits to those who install things like rainwater harvesting. And that's something that Clive has alluded to as well. The real challenge, though, is in the institutionalization of the adaptation to a new reality. I think this means that we need to challenge the role of water utilities, those that provide, that give water to consumers. It also means a change in the approach to urban planning and development. And that means that we have to look at how do we use the planning system to encourage, which we are not doing at the moment, the uptake of these adaptations. And that also poses challenge in the enabling environment and regulatory conditions. We are not at the moment at the place where we could start to, in our terms of our regulatory capacities and organizations, to look at these new regulatory agencies, look at the water provider. They do not look further than that. So that is a challenge. Then there are also public health concerns and social acceptability. And for all this to happen, there needs to be political leadership. It needs to be a thrust that this is where we want to go in terms of policy. There are some technological challenges or opportunities, if you prefer, for resource recovery. We already see that energy, there is possibility of recovering energy, but there are also challenges from emerging contaminants. And then there's the social side of this, which really does worry me, is that if we are looking to create these opportunities for water adaptation, to look at changing the water cycle, we run the risk of embedding further discrepancies in our social makeup. So those in the lower income groups will not be able to enter into this new reality, whereas those in the middle and upper income brackets will be able to afford this. And so we don't want to entrench existing social challenges within society. So what is the alternative to this? If we don't start looking at adaptation, we are going to run the risk of day zeros, you know, that case we had in Cape Town, on a recurring basis. In other words, we're not going to be able to meet the demands of our population, and that's going to have a lot of social and psychological and economic effects. Yes, we could desalinate our way out of it, but that will have the same issues of affordability that I've been alluding to. And lastly, I think what I'm suggesting is that we need to rethink the way water is governed, the governance of it, because at the moment we have water utilities provide a product. They provide you with something in the home. They do not provide a service. There are obviously people that would disagree with me on this, but a service means looking at every stage of that water cycle.
Regarder chaque étape de ce cycle de l'eau. Donc, c'est peut-être une vision très globale de la question du.
But I think that if the elements are there for us to be able to respond positively and maintain development opportunities and improve social and economic standing of our populations. And so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the panel, for the presentations from the panelists. So we have very little time left. I think we may have just a few questions, which you all will be able to answer. One of the questions is that I would like to ask is, what are the simple water conservation solutions that can be applicable for the Caribbean? That's one question. The other one is, what is the impact of excessive water use in the Caribbean, on the Caribbean ability to adapt to climate change? And the other last question I would like to ask is, are there other interventions to be considered for the application to ensure the use of water in the Caribbean? So a question for each one of you. So Clive, you can go ahead first, sir.
Thank you, Colin. I'm not sure I got your last question, so I'll let the others tackle that one. I think the other two actually may be quite similar. I mean, water conservation solutions, I mean, more generally, I mean, at the household level, of course, as Adrian said, you know, there's perhaps 90% of water in the household eventually goes down the toilet. So ways to try and reuse some of that grey water that comes out of the sinks is something which is practiced in areas which have a lack of water that's available to them. But I think it is a challenge in the house. Obviously, people need to take responsibility for leakage within the house. But if rates are low, then it is a challenge. I think more widely, you asked about excessive water use. And the impacts that has in terms of the region to adapt. I mean, clearly, the more water we're using, as Adrian said, you know, it's the same amount of water or less water in the future that is available in the water cycle. So, if we are taking more, there is, you know, our water resources are more fragile and are more likely to be impacted. Our water supply systems are maxing out, so you don't have any spare capacity. You don't have any storage for these, you know, for outages and for these dry periods. But it also actually represents an opportunity, because if you have excessive water use, then you do have the opportunity to start to introduce efficiencies, as Adrian said. And obviously, one of the big areas that most of us are aware of is in the high levels of leakage that many of the utility systems struggle to deal with, and getting that down and from say 50–60% down to 30%, which is achievable but not necessarily cheap, and may need tariffs to reflect that investment, is a way of almost doubling the amount of water you have available. And this can push the planning horizons back to provide you with that buffer to tackle climate change. I'll stop there, just I'm aware of time, and I'm sure the others wish to contribute.
Yes, thank you. If I can, I would like to share just a few thoughts back from the study in Bolivia. There are 3 points that I would like to share with you. First, long-term planning. I think that one of the best ways to conserve water is to plan ahead the use of water. How is that certain time periods will change the availability of water. So long-term planning is an important thing. The implementation of integrated water resources management is also a very good business mode that is being implemented in South America nowadays. And then the coordination among different sectors.
On réfléchit de plus en plus en Amérique.
Les secteurs agricoles.
Et ensuite, s'assurer qu'on a
quand il utilise l'eau, il doit
que
l'utilisation,
qu'on ait une planification méticuleuse de la distribution et de l'utilisation de l'eau dans la communauté. Et peut-être que je pourrais intervenir sur un certain nombre de points et que je pourrais partager avec vous. Nous sommes très conscients
que,
par exemple, les gens, ils ont des...
by electricity companies, utilities. I want to pose the question, why are water utilities not looking at household water storage in the same way? What are the barriers to that? Water utilities invest a lot of money on storing water so that they can meet demand. Yet, if we have the opportunity to do this at the household level, I know that there are a lot. I want to just throw that out there. It is actually discussed in a paper that Global Water Partnership Caribbean have put out recently this year on water storage challenges in the Caribbean. So I think, and that leads us to something that Alfred was saying about the importance of governing and adaptation and how you embed adaptation, challenging the way we think. Simple measures. Let me tell you a simple measure that I've adopted to my water consumption. I put a bucket in my shower. I am amazed that how much water, and I don't take long showers. I'm generally speaking a very clean person. But I'm amazed at how much water I can collect in that bucket every 2 days. And I have enough to go out there and water some of my plants. If I really wanted to, I could put it in the cistern of my toilet. Other things that people can do, as Clive said, a lot of the water that we use is from the toilet. You don't have to flush it every time you go for number one. No, there. So there are simple measures that we can all do that will not discomfort us, that are very easy to do. We could go on. Excessive consumption, that's a whole, how do we, as Clive said, it's wrong, but there are opportunities that we can cut down. That's a whole discussion by itself. And I do agree with him that non-revenue water and addressing non-revenue water utility, if you're asking households to cut down on their water consumption, water utilities also have to step up to the mark at the same time. I'm going to leave it there.
Yes, so this was my other question to the panelists. How you think that the private sector can participate in the development of systems to ensure water security? This was the so this was the question I was about to ask now.
I'm going to jump in on that one, and because the example I was going to get that I gave of Jamaica, a lot of that housing development is taking place through private developers, right? They have a huge role. If they are offered the right incentives, the carrots and the stick, the stick being the planning regime, and they're offered the incentives that there's finance available that they can recoup some of the investment. I think the private sector, certainly in the housing where that is, and in all countries across the Caribbean, housing is a major investment and a major demand. So I think there is one way. The other way is with the water utilities as well. But I'll leave it to the others to maybe chip in with some of their thoughts.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, a lot of the work we did on rainwater harvesting identified the opportunity to influence the costs. I mean, it's fair to say, obviously, that the private sector it's profit focused, or at least it's loss avoidance. So they need some stability, they need some clarity in terms of the direction, partly which is driven by having clear policies on these issues, partly on planning and legislation, as Adrian alluded to. But a series of tariffs and rebates and reductions in taxes, these will inevitably channel and focus the private sector into these areas. And these are much more effective than trying to take regulatory approaches. And regulatory approaches have to, you have to ensure that they're complied with. And in a small island states in particular, are human resource poor or short. There's not enough to do this. So it's much better to see the private sector as enablers. But of course, the private sector extends beyond commerce and business to the public. And again, I think this is where the rainwater harvesting project, and I would encourage people to access the information on the PPCR website, recognized that in order to encourage householders and communities to invest in climate resilience, you have to make it affordable, but you also have to make it incremental, because
okay, thank you, Clive. Yeah. Alfred, yeah. Do you have anything? Yeah, because we need to wrap up now.
Thank you. No, just want to say that in order for the private sector to enter, I think it's important that the public sector creates an enabling environment to do that. And one of the ways to do that is with governance and basically make sure that all the water system schemes are there so the private sector can get in. I don't have anything else to say. I think that my colleagues have already said it all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, all the panelists, Clive, Adrian, and also Alfred, for the presentations. I think that the wealth of knowledge, information that we have received. Thank you very much. A lot of information that have been presented. I hope that the private sectors will participate in, and also not only on private sector, but the government officials also will participate in this listening discussion, and they would able to incorporate that into the daily plan and their daily activities as they go forward, to really take care of the impacts of the water scarcity that we are facing in the Caribbean. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Thanks much.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks much.
Thank you.